1943, November. Day 21. The American offensive in the islands of the Central Pacific grinds on. The Marines have the objective of 3 beaches: Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3. At Betio, on Tarawa, the constant fire of Shibasaki's coastal batteries continues. The Allied command orders the support ships headed by the battleship Maryland and the warplanes to attack the Japanese positions at Betio again. The Tarawa Atoll is turned into a hellhole from which it is very difficult to emerge alive. At 8:30, more assault troops prepare to take to the landing craft heading for the beaches. "300 meters from them, from both sides of the bay, numerous camouflaged machine guns surprise the Marines with deadly fire. The tide continues to favor the Japanese. It remains very low, and the amphibious vehicles again get stuck on the reefs and are turned into steel coffins. In a nightmarish scene of blood and death, hundreds of bodies float in the water, while those Marines that survive doggedly advance towards the objective. Those that have emerged from the rain of enemy shells join thousands of their comrades pinned down on the narrow and bloody strip of sand. Provisions are scarce, and the medics don't have the means to attend to the wounded. The insistent Japanese fire keeps the soldiers pinned down on the beach. At the same time, there is no let-up in the bombardment of the island from the aircraft carriers. In 2 hours, 3,000 tons of explosives have turned the area of Betio and Tarawa into a hellish cauldron where Keiji Shibaseki has lost his life. Nevertheless, at dusk, for most of the Allied troops, the situation is still critical. Many of the amphibious vehicles are stranded on the reefs, and the surviving soldiers make for the coast under heavy fire. At nightfall, the tide rises, and the landing craft finally clear the coral reefs. Meanwhile, at the Allied command post, the messages calling for help are constant. Red 2 here. They've got us pinned down. This is Red 1 speaking. We have lots of casualties. Red 3 reporting. We cannot resist much longer. The last wave of reinforcements was annihilated. Day 22. In the early hours of the 22nd, a tense silence engulfs the island. The guns of the Japanese artillery and the Allied fleet have gone quiet. The Japanese are conscious of the fact that they cannot count on Shibaseki, and their defenses are greatly damaged. Nervously, they wait for the Marines to attack. At dawn, supplies reach the beaches where, due to the tropical heat, the stench of death is unbearable. The order to advance is passed along the line, and the soldiers abandon the beachheads and, accompanied by bulldozers and flamethrowers, head inland to search out and destroy the Japanese in their hideouts. The Japanese positions are eliminated one after another, and by dusk, the Allied troops reach the airfield and the green beach to the west of the island. During the night, a group of Japanese soldiers that know all the corners of Betio Island penetrate the American lines in a last-ditch suicide attack. But the entrenched Marines finish off all of them. Day 23. In the early hours of the morning, the cleanup operation begins. The Allied troops continue to advance, while a few dozen Japanese soldiers put up fierce resistance, and others commit suicide. By the end of the battle, only 129 of them are left. The American dead number 1,000, and there are more than 2,500 wounded men. The engineers quickly repair the landing strip, and in the afternoon, the first U.S. plane lands. Tarawa Atoll is secure. Fearful of the operational capacity of the enemy, Japan has managed to turn Rabaul into a veritable fort. 80,000 soldiers occupy the island of New Britain to the northeast of Port Moresby. It has 5 operational air bases and is a center of operations for the Imperial Fleet. At the end of November, Task Group 38, under the command of Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, together with the aircraft carriers Saratoga and Princeton, begin operations against Rabaul. The U.S. fighters' surprise attack destroys the cruisers and destroyers in the base, and a second wave from the aircraft carriers Bunker Hill, Essex, and Independence meet the Japanese counterattack, shooting down 60 planes. Japan's offensive capacity begins to go into decline. The ships of the Imperial Navy that still exist withdraw to the North Pacific. Rabaul has been strangled thanks to the airfields built in the surrounding island jungles. On the 25th of December, 1943, Allied troops disembark in New Britain and begin their march on the base of Rabaul. The offensive continues to take steps along the road to Tokyo. (1944). Burma, now Myanmar, fell into Japanese hands in 1942. At the head of the troops deployed in the country is General Renya Mutaguchi, who plans to occupy the Indian city of Imphal on the other side of the frontier with Burma, with a view to establishing a base to block the British threat from that country. Mutaguchi is convinced that the British are planning an offensive from the west of Burma and does not have much time to prepare defensive positions along the frontier zone. However, first it is necessary to put an end to the British presence in Arakan on the southwest flank. The Japanese need to defeat the enemy before May, when the monsoon rains set in, bringing the danger of bridges and landing strips in their rear being washed away. Overflowing rivers will flood the valleys, making supply lines unusable until October, when the heavy rains stop in this part of Asia. The weather places the Japanese in a situation which means they will have to triumph or die. Meanwhile, the Allies have landed at Sidor, to the north of Papua New Guinea, and begin an enveloping operation that isolates a part of the Japanese forces from their main base at Madang. "20,000 Japanese soldiers have been trapped between Australian and US forces, the jungle being their only escape route. The fighting continues in the half-light of the jungle, all through January, until the Allied troops take the fortification of Kankiryo to the south of Madang. On their route to Tokyo, Nimitz and MacArthur have planned as the next step to take the Marshall, Carolina, and Mariana Islands. Initially, operations center on the atolls of Majuru, Namu, and Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands. Thousands of Marines land on the beaches and come up against heavy resistance from Japanese troops that fight until the last breath. After weeks of combat, the Americans take the islands. They have lost 500 men, but they have decimated the Japanese army, killing or wounding more than 10,000 men. The city of Imphal is situated on a high plain surrounded by mountains and jungle. Access to it is possible via the road that goes to Kohima. This sinuous road and the railway line are crucial objectives for the Japanese. But in order to occupy them, they must first defeat the troops of General William Slim. Operation Ha-Go begins on the 4th of February. The Japanese try to approach the British positions in the area of Arakan from the south to open a front and distract the attention of the troops situated in Imphal and Kohima. But the British, who know of their plans, begin the counter-offensive with the Chindits Brigades, Indian Special Infantry Forces, which, under the command of General Ord Charles Wingate, intend to cross the Burmese frontier from Lido and the River Chindwin to head to Indal. At the same time, from China, General Joseph Stilwell prepares his incursion through the northeast of the country to take the city of Mitikina and expel the Japanese from that part of Burma. Mutaguchi orders his troops to confront the British forces that have crossed the River Chindwin and halt their advance. After heavy fighting, the Indian divisions are forced to retreat via the road from Imphal to Kohima, trying to save their tanks and supplies. The Indian nationalist leader, Chandra Bose, who supports the Japanese in the hope of gaining independence for his country, orders his poorly supplied militia to cut off the British retreat to the cities of Imphal and Kohima. The second phase of the Japanese offensive begins on the 15th of March with Operation U-Go. 120,000 soldiers deploy along the River Chindwin on a 200-kilometer front and take the Tidin Road to the Allied bases of Imphal and Kohima. By the start of April, the Japanese have established a stronghold in Shenam, near Imphal, which they use as a base to launch heavy attacks against the Indian cities. For Chandra Bose, the capture of Imphal is crucial, as he sees it as the beginning of the liberation of his country. Together with Kohima, the British supplied the defenders from the air, though on many occasions the enemy soldiers that besiege them are the ones who benefit. On the 6th of April, Kohima falls into the hands of the Japanese and Indian nationalist troops, and an exultant Chandra Bose places the Indian tricolor at the highest point of the city. But the Allies have one great advantage over the enemy: complete control of the air, and they are determined to use it. Their planes constantly attack the Japanese supply lines, interrupting the flow. In mid-May, the Indian and British forces defending Imphal note a drop in the intensity of the enemy attacks. The air raids have paid off, and the Japanese find themselves in a desperate situation, short of food and ammunition. What is more, the monsoon, as expected, has led to rivers overflowing their banks and cutting roads. Added to this, cholera and malaria are beginning to take a toll among the Japanese troops. On the 3rd of June, lacking an air force capable of taking on the RAF, tired and famished, the Japanese troops abandon Kohima and withdraw from their positions around Imphal. By the 8th of July, Toho and the Japanese General Staff have realized that what was planned as a great offensive has become a defensive battle, and they bring to an end one of the costliest actions of the war. Close to 100,000 men have been killed or wounded in the forces under Japanese command, most of them Indians. The remainder need supplies, or they will be forced to surrender. Scattered in different groups, they make for the Burmese frontier. In the Pacific, U.S. troops have completed the conquest of the Marshall Islands, occupying Enewetak Atoll. At the same time, General Douglas MacArthur, at the head of 52,000 men, continues the landings in Papua New Guinea. The last of these is at Hollandia, in the north of the island, where they try to destroy the Japanese garrisons left in the area. On the 11th of June, Nimitz ships cross the Central Pacific en route to the Mariana and Carolina Islands, sending out their planes over Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and Pagan. Saipan, the base of the Japanese fleet in the area, is the first objective. The Imperial High Command, conscious of the fact that the Mariana Islands are vital to the security of Japan, orders Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa to use his first fleet of aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines to throw back the attack. Nimitz intends to cut the sea links with Japan to stop supplies from reaching the islands. On the 13th of June, the United States Navy artillery and warplanes pound the Japanese positions in Saipan, preparing the way for the landings of Marines heading for the west coast. The destruction of the aerodrome at Guam and the planes on the ground has significantly weakened the Japanese offensive capacity. Now, they only have 570 planes on their aircraft carriers against more than 1,000 in the Allied fleet. On the 15th of June, 130,000 American soldiers land on the Mariana Islands and confront the fanatical Japanese defenders. Meanwhile, B-29s take off from their base in China to bomb the iron and steel factories of Yahata in Japan. On the 19th, the Battle of the Philippine Sea begins. The aircraft carriers commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher confronted the ships of Admiral Ozawa, who was considered to be Japan's best naval strategist after Yamamoto. The young, inexperienced Japanese pilots pit themselves against the well-trained American flyers in their Hellcat fighters. In just one day, Japan suffers the worst air defeat in its history, with 350 planes shot down. The Allies lose only 30. The massacre will come to be known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. In the naval battle, Nimitz submarines sink 3 aircraft carriers and 2 tankers. Osawa flees north in the direction of Okinawa, convinced he will soon have to defend Japan. British soldiers have repaired the Imphal-Koima road, and the supply lines begin operating again. The invasion of India has been thrown back, but Burma is still in Japanese hands. On the 22nd of June, the Chindits begin the attack on Mogaung. After 3 days of heavy fighting, the city falls. With their supply lines disrupted by the monsoon, the Japanese find themselves short of food and ammunition. Starving and exhausted by the many months of fighting, the retreat becomes an odyssey of suffering and death. Between them and the relative safety of the plains of central Burma are the mountains and thick jungle. The difficulties of the journey lead to thousands of sick and wounded men being abandoned en route, leaving a desolate trail through the flooded jungle and valleys. The Allied troops that follow them enjoy air supremacy and are kept supplied and have the means to evacuate sick and wounded men. Nimitz and MacArthur meet with Roosevelt in Hawaii. The American president wants to discuss the next steps in the Pacific campaign. After securing the Central Pacific, the idea of Chester Nimitz and Admiral Ernst King is to attack Taiwan and avoid the Philippines. But for MacArthur, retaking the Philippines is more than a question of strategy. He promised he would return, and the Philippine people and his soldiers are waiting. Roosevelt comes down in favor of MacArthur's proposal. Once current operations are completed, the Philippines will be the next objective. On the 6th of July, in the final phase of the Allied occupation of the island of Saipan, General Kaiji Saito and Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, commit suicide. In the ancient code of the Japanese Bushido, seppuku is the ritual of the heroic death of the defeated. Following the example of the two commanders, 8,000 of their soldiers commit suicide inside caves before being captured. On the 19th of July, the Americans carry out heavy preliminary bombing of Guam, the largest and most southerly of the Mariana Islands, which was under U.S. control until the Japanese occupation in 1941. Its large size is ideal for establishing air bases, and the deep water of the Bay of Apra provides anchorage for bigger ships. Surrounded by reefs and cliffs, the Marines disembark on the beaches of Agana and Agat on the west of the island, 2 days after the naval artillery barrage. The Japanese respond from their positions and attempt a number of counterattacks during the night, but these fail. Agana, the destroyed capital of Guam, falls to the Allies on July 28th. General Takeshi Takahima, at the head of the garrison, dies in its defense. The airfield of Orote and the Bay of Apra are occupied on the 30th, when Japanese forces, low on provisions, withdraw to the south of the island. Heavy rain and dense jungle once again make it very difficult for combat conditions. The American infantry hunt down the Japanese who fight to the death in small groups or disappear into the jungle. Sergeant Soichi Yokoi was found by some hunters on the 24th of January 1972 after 27 years alone in the jungle. Some Chamorros, the natives of Guam, are freed from concentration camps, and others come down from the hills where they have been hiding. Frightened, sick, and tired, they receive help from Allied soldiers and medics. Their nightmare ordeal had come to an end. For them, the fight for survival is over. In Guam, 20,000 Japanese soldiers have lost their lives against 1,800 casualties in the Allied Army. The engineers begin to build 5 airfields to serve as a base for the powerful B-29s to attack objectives in the West Pacific and in Japan. On the 24th of July, the Marines disembark on the island of Tinian. The assault troops have taken the Gilbert, Marshall, and Mariana Islands. The road is almost clear for MacArthur to liberate the Philippines. There is only one difficult barrier to overcome: the Palau Archipelago. Peleliu, one of its southern islands, is strategically important due to its excellent airfield. The Japanese prepare for the enemy invasion and send to the island Lieutenant General Sade Inoue with 10,000 of his best soldiers. Inoue does not believe the old military adage of, "If you control the beach, you control everything." An open battle with Allied forces would end in huge losses, so it is necessary to adopt a different form of defense. The Japanese take full advantage of the terrain, building caves in the hillsides. Connected by tunnels, their openings at different levels house innumerable machine gun nests and artillery placements. More than 500 caves are prepared to meet the Allied invasion. Some have up to 5 or 6 levels and are reinforced to resist aerial and naval bombardments. Inoue names Colonel Kuni Nakanawa to lead the forces in Peleliu. Nakanawa skillfully deploys his units on Peleliu Island and further south on the island of Anguar. The Japanese defense system is organized. The order is to resist until the last man. Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, gives instructions for the next stage of operations to begin. Admiral Halsey's ships go into action, and for 10 consecutive days, planes from the aircraft carriers bomb the island of Peleliu. The most important strategic point in the airfield, situated to the south and protected by the mountainous areas where Inoue has established part of his defenses. The rising land, covered in thick vegetation that extends to the north, is the key to control of the airfield. Getting control of it is the first objective. Allied battleships and destroyers begin a 4-day bombardment. Colonel Nakanawa and his men on Peleliu Island endure the shelling and await the landings of 20,000 Marines. On the 15th of September, the assault troops head for the island under heavy fire from its defenders and with the danger of innumerable underwater mines to contend with along the coast. Landing craft and the men inside are blown out of the water. Those that survive and skirt the reef find themselves under fire from different directions when they reach the coast. A dense cloud of smoke partially obscures a scene of horror. Mangled bodies floating in the sea. The noise of gunfire and bombs is pierced by screams for help from the wounded. From his hidden command post at the top of the hill, an exultant Colonel Nakanawa radios General Inoue. "We do not need reinforcements. The invaders will be annihilated by the end of the day." At Anguar, the U.S. 81st Division lands without meeting any resistance. But in the caves of the Ramuldo Hill, in the far northwest of the island, heavily outnumbered, 1,600 Japanese troops are preparing to resist until the death. In Peleliu, meanwhile, the impetuous Colonel Nakanawa believes the moment has arrived to launch a counterattack and annihilate the enemy once and for all. In its place, Nakanawa undertakes a stealthy assault, protecting his forces behind 13 tanks. Allied advance patrols spot them, and 5 Sherman tanks go out to meet them. It is the first tank battle in the Pacific War. The American tanks open fire, and their assault forces carry out an enveloping operation. Nakanawa's tanks are destroyed, and he and his elite troops are mown down by the Marines. The rest of the Japanese troops, who have seen their comrades being killed from their positions, scatter throughout the jungle or into the caves. On the 19th of September, the Allies head for the airfield. The continual fights as Japanese soldiers jump out of their hiding places like ghosts and fire on them creates an atmosphere of extreme tension among the Marines. The Japanese, hidden in their fortified caves, seem indestructible, and the American losses increase rapidly. Finally, the Americans realize the caves are interconnected by underground passages that enable the Japanese to slip away and regroup in different places. The fight becomes a slow and costly hunt for the enemy in the warren of caves and passages. Cave by cave, the Americans, armed with flamethrowers and hand grenades, hunt down and kill the Japanese. On the 12th of October, the 1st Marines Division, with half of their troops out of action, declare the phase of occupation completed. But the last groups of Japanese still on the island continue fighting for another 6 weeks.